look at this idea called competing frames, like which is like within like a same news story or any kind of media text that we are looking at could have different frames competing for attention is the idea. So it could be like quite nuanced, like maybe like there are like several frames operating in the same story as well. So I mean, we can remember like especially during like the coronavirus times, how a lot of this misinformation and disinformation was kind of framed through very specific sort of frames. Especially we remember like things like the conspiracy theories. If you remember, like how there were very specific sort of ways that they were framed in those stories. So we can look at like one article that actually looks at the spread of COVID-19 misinformation. Like that also helps us to ground framing into a much more sort of online digital kind of space from its usual sort of research context on news media. But we can look at much more sort of how this happens in a social media context, like how we can apply also the idea of framing in a context of social media like Facebook in this article. So what they're looking at is how there were specific narratives around conspiracy theories and how they were framed in a certain way to spread a kind of misinformation online. And a special sort of a focus here in this study is one kind of an affordance that Facebook actually provided to popularize this kind of story. So they're looking at coordinated link sharing behavior, which is like how there was this massive coordinated sort of effort to share specific kinds of news that led to these conspiracy theories and misinformation. But there was like a major coordinated effort to actually share this kind of news, which made the news really popular and created traction on algorithmic contexts as well. So these could be like real people, they could even be like social bots and things like that. But we can see that this feature in particular, that ability to share links to like a large coordinated effort, actually led to sort of promotion of like several unproven conspiracy theories here. So this one actually focused very much on one of the press conferences in America, but it kind of spiraled out of hand as well because there was like such a big sort of effort to share links around COVID-19 and conspiracy theories that led to the that led to the fueling of misinformation and spreading of misinformation as well. So that ability to actually share, right? So sharing, so that is like one of the key sort of aspects here and affordance of Facebook or most of our sort of social media is that ability we have to share things, especially share links. So that is kind of the center of this article, like how that affordance actually help to frame specific COVID-19 misinformation and conspiracy theories. So you can see like then like even in social media context, like not just news media context, but also in social media context, how we can produce certain narratives and how we can create very specific problem definitions, very specific frames around this as these kind of issues as well. So what happened in the context of framing in social media is that idea again sort of comes back to what we were talking about, I guess, when we were looking at spiral of silence and also like in agenda setting, this political polarization that happens so widely in our social media spaces. So we can see like politically motivated narratives and in particularly in that case with the Facebook and spread of misinformation during COVID. So we can see that how it kind of led to this political kind of polarization as well. So in our assignments, I guess, like for us, our projects, like we are actually trying to understand similar patterns, but instead of this kind of large scale sort of social media narratives, because we're doing qualitative kind of research, we are much more interested in the subject who is at the center of this kind of project. So in our case, like we are interviewing someone, so what we can look for in our interview transcripts maybe is actually what is that individual's perception of frames. So we can structure our questions in a way so that we can find out things about how is it that our interviewee is actually receiving these kind of frames as well. So an individual's engagement in framing, like what are they doing, like are they sharing, are they hashtagging, like what are the things that they are doing to contribute to certain frames or creating certain frames. So an individual's activity influencing frames, like how are they kind of influencing frames, like maybe it's through consumption, maybe it's through production of their own content, but how are they actually influencing this kind of narratives. And also like, yeah, so something that we can also perhaps look for in our interview transcripts is to see whether an individual's experience of being overwhelmed by multiple frames exist as well, right? So is it overwhelming to be in the center of this kind of competing frames, like so if there are like many kinds of like different frames acting about a specific issue, so like the COVID-19 stuff that we were talking about earlier, is it overwhelming for someone to actually be subjected to that kind of competing frames? And yeah, so how do they navigate through this? Like, what is the logic that kind of operates in selecting or in facing these kind of frames? And we can think about the problem definitions. What are the things that this person is using as background information or historical problems or cultural or social kind of problems to understand these frames as well? So these are some of the things that we can do to create a more sort of a subjective understanding of framing in our projects, and that will also help us to move much more into like that qualitative sort of aspect about trying to understand what are the frames. So I guess we can talk a little bit like quickly about the origins of like the framing analysis. It all sort of starts with Irving Goffman's work on framing analysis. So he actually proposed like how to do a framing analysis in his work as well. And we can see like some of the early works, some of the early books that kind of came about like framing analysis from Goffman's point of view as well. So it's actually a sociological kind of perspective that he tried to sort of provide by thinking of like framing as an analysis to understand media text. So it kind of helps us to think about framing as something that enables us to make sense of our everyday world, like how especially like in media and communication context, how are messages constructed in this context. And frames help to define and typify situations, like we can kind of try to organize or categorize very sort of chaotic or very diverse situations into sort of categories. We can sort of think about finding some meaning in the way that some issues are kind of being framed. And there also like in frames we can see like there are specific sets of expectations which help to make sense of a social or political situation, like especially like everything that's happening these days, like with the international conflicts. Like we can kind of try to understand how this has been framed in media and communication context, to understand what kind of directions or what kind of meanings these texts are actually making to our everyday lives as well. So they're kind of also giving us like this chance or opportunity to think about how meanings are being negotiated in these different sort of texts as well. And then frames are also sort of seen as vital to creating kinds of ideologies as well. So if a certain issue has been framed in a certain way throughout a long period of time, like you are tend to sort of lean towards that ideology, and it could be very convincing as well if you frame a certain issue in one specific way for a long time as well. So it kind of provides a central idea or a central meaning to a specific event if something has been framed in a certain way as well. So yeah, so I guess like in like we can also like here consider Entman and how he sort of uses Goffman's work here as well to expand on the idea of like framing. And he says that to frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality. So again, like reality here is like a perceived reality, so it could be real or not, but like you're taking something from our real everyday life, but it has been framed in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, casual interpretation, moral evaluation, and treatment. So, yeah, so that's kind of what he took from like Goffman's work and embedded into this understanding of frames as he sort of perceived, especially like this idea called problem definition, kind of coming into play in his definition of frames here as well. Um, so I guess, yeah, so like for our projects, like how all this kind of means, or what it means for our projects like on social media, is that we are trying to look for framing of an issue by the interviewee. So that is the most important thing I think that we are trying to do in our projects. Like we're trying to see how the interviewee actually understands these frames as well. So in our sort of the way that we construct our questions in particular could be about questions about how to find out about what the position of the interviewee is about the frames that operate in a certain social media context. So yeah, to simply sort of think about a frame. A frame is the way in which media professionals organize a given story to provide the audience with meaning. So this is kind of the early definition of framing, and you can see like again like this focus on media professionals, but I guess in our context, like we are looking more and more at the individual subject, and in our qualitative kind of perspective, we have shifted this focus of the media professional into audience and reception, right? So that's kind of what we have done in our projects, and particularly for this subject, and audience research as a field as well is trying to understand how this idea of the media professional has been replaced by a more subjective experience of personalized communication in social media spaces. So that is kind of what we are doing. So I guess like in our sense of frame is the way in which the audience has organized a given story to provide some kind of a meaning or make sense of that story. So in our context, like that individual or the subjective sort of individual is the center of the projects that we are doing here. um, yeah, so a frame is again so it's important, I think, like another really important element here is that a frame is actually something that is socially constructed. So so we can see like lots of reasons, lots of sort of political, social, cultural sort of context compete in a certain environment to produce a very specific sort of a message around some kind of a story or a social media context, or any kind of like media and communication context as well. So this could also, so I think this is like really important here, that it kind of constitutes a interpretive kind of a definition of social reality. So I guess like that is kind of what your interviewees who you're going to interview about social media will also do. So they will interpret what they see as frames as well. So it's a very interpretive kind of a environment. So how two people will see a story might be like quite different. Like it might be quite sort of different in the way that meanings are constructed. So yeah, so it is an interpretive sort of a social reality. So you can kind of think of it in that more qualitative kind of aspect as well. So there could be cultural identities, social institutions, political systems, economic dynamics, which we call macro structures again. So very sort of broad structures operating to produce this very interpretive and very personalized or subjective kind of frames as well. So I mean, if you look at like another popular cultural story, I thought like because this was like just all over the news and like on social media, like this is like a really big story when Timothy Chalamet, like the American actor, was received a lot of backlash because he rejected classical forms of art like ballet and opera. Like he said, like no one goes to the ballet opera or something on that line. So he kind of rejected this kind of sort of performance arts, and there's a big backlash about this in the news. And for some reason, my timeline was like inundated with this news as well on social media. So I think like I mean again similar to that other story that we were looking at earlier, like we can see like there were like various ways that this was like reported. So we can see like a lot of sort of stories covering on that backlash kind of issue. So we can kind of again think of these different terminologies to try and understand like how is this actually framed. So what are the ways this kind of a popular cultural story getting a lot of traction, a lot of attention on social media, but how is it actually also being framed as well? So we can say like there's so we can identify that like there are several frames here. Like one is of course like this frame of like backlash, like a frame that kind of rejects what this actor was talking about. And then in this sort of paper, the Guardian, like they're kind of saying that okay, so let's not denounce this actor, but also let's kind of prove that this is wrong, that we can kind of support the arts and performance industries much more, maybe by providing more funding and things like that as well. So there's a treatment recommendation in this article, isn't there? Like it's saying that okay, let's not reject this let's not kind of reject what this actor was talking about. Like it's actually true that there has been like these industries have been struggling without funding. So there's like a treatment recommendation. So the treatment or the solution is perhaps to provide more funding and uplift this kind of sort of industries. So yeah, so again, like what's the problem definition? Like what are the frames in these articles? So is there like a moral evaluations here? So we can see like clearly there's a moral evaluation, like there's like a lot of backlash around this issue. So maybe that is something to do with like a morality and sort of that that we really don't want to see this kind of rejection of performance arts as well. So yeah, so that's just kind of like an example, and it's quite interesting to sort of see or experiment and also to like try out this framing analysis. So we can kind of use them as a bit of like examples to see how frames have kind of worked here as well. So yeah, so there are like types of frames that we can look at. So if you look at a news story like that, or like a social media sort of story, like what are the types of frames that you can identify as well? So there's like so frames like in media and communication, like lots of research and lots of studies actually focus a lot on like the news media. But I think what some of the studies that we talked about earlier in this lecture showed that the framing analysis has also come to digital social media spaces as well. So we use things like images, words, headlines, subheadings, quotations and things like that, usually in media and communication studies, to analyze frames. So we can look at, so we can see like there are lots of like texts, so images, headlines, subheadings, so this is quotations. So we can even add videos and things like that into this mix as well. So by looking at this kind of text, we try to analyze like what are the frames. We try to kind of deconstruct what are the frames. So that is kind of what we do in a framing analysis. So there are like various types of frames, like I mean things like generic frames, which are which has like a very straightforward sort of idea that comes mainly from like official authoritative sort of viewpoints. So there could be like just one very clear message from some kind of a political authority to actually create a very simple kind of a direct generic frame, and that could be imperative to build a storyline. So I mean, we can like think about government advertising, for example, with like very straightforward messages. If you look at like the issues around sort of migration and refugees, so we've seen like government advertisings like this in Australia, at least, sort of just sort of with a very direct message as well. So you can see just like the text and just an image, and that's like sending like a very clear sort of a frame. So that is what we call here a generic frame. It's coming from authoritative viewpoint as well, which is the point of like a generic frame. Um, but we can also see that sometimes like we have alternative frames, so we have like several sources, several viewpoints that are indexed, and according to the magnitude and contents of conflicts among key government decision makers or other players with power. So again, like positioning like different sources of power, so you're providing like alternative sort of viewpoints about the same story. Like for example, like again with the refugee sort of context, like you can see like there has been like in the past like talks about this deal between US and Australia. So you can see like some of the papers kind of reporting on that, focusing on both sort of authoritative positions, and creating this kind of like alternative, what we call alternative frames, by using sort of addressing these two different sort of authoritative voices as well. And then we also have conflict frames or attention frames that are kind of also frames that are created beyond normal institutions and news beats. So kind of beyond the normal messaging or the dominant kind of messaging. So there could be like frames that conflict with this kind. So this kind of a generic frame, something that conflicts with that kind of a frame is also to create that refugees are welcomed in a country, right? So that kind of reporting creates a bit of a conflict frame with the generic messaging as well. So we have what we called like also like contesting frames. So that is kind of uh, providing lots of sources and challenge sort of existing policies or official definitions of a certain issue, with a focus on bringing like marginalized ideas into the center of a news coverage. So it could be, again, like if we are looking at the refugee sort of context and migration and immigration sort of context. Yeah, so we are here in this article, like they're reporting about how people gather to support refugees, right? So it's kind of creating a contesting kind of a frame as well. So it's kind of bringing that marginalized ideas kind of into the center of like a news coverage there. So yeah, so what's kind of, I guess this also kind of shows us that a lot of like framing research currently falls into that news media kind of context. So there's a lot of sort of studies using framing research. So very traditional ways of using a framing analysis is to think about news media and how news media kind of reports issues using different frames. But I think what is actually missing mainly is that need for qualitative interviews. So we need to kind of think about so this kind of very common sort of ways of doing framing analysis, but this need for like qualitative interviews, and how do we kind of flip this perspective into the audience or the social media kind of context when you're thinking of like a framing analysis. So far, like they use that very traditional methods of like comparing one news and like one news issue and looking at different perspectives of coverage of that same news. So how is that same news reported by different sort of news articles? And there's a lot of like quantitative content kind of analysis and lots of sort of US and Europe sort of focus studies and also like survey kind of large studies. So I guess this kind of brings back to our own projects, and that is kind of what we are doing. We are addressing that gap in framing research by providing a qualitative aspect, and especially also moving this to that audience kind of aspect as well. So some tips, I guess, for us to take away from this lecture in starting a framing analysis for our projects, I guess. So we will be actually working with the interview transcript, so we can actually read the transcript thoroughly to identify things like problem definitions, like how does your interviewee identify this kind of like problem definitions, identify generic or like other frames, and maybe in your analysis, like you can try to analyze about 3 different frames. The other thing is like again, this is qualitative sort of research. So as the researcher, you can name these frames that you have identified by analyzing your transcript. So as the researcher, like you can make these decisions, like but you're supporting your decisions with evidence, like so the evidence can come from quotations, things that your interviewee actually said in the interview. So if you take that Taj Mahal necklace story that we looked at earlier, for example, so we can provide the names for the frames that we identified. So in that story, we saw decolonial kind of elements in the reports that we saw. So there were like frames around glamour, around that idea of artifact. So these names actually. So if I was doing the framing analysis using that story, so these are names that I would use as the researcher to organize my data, right? So that is something that you have the capacity as the researcher to decide what are the frames that has happened in this article or in this sort of news text, or in your case, like in your transcript, like what are the quotations that you can use to support the frame. So in the earlier sort of example, we use the decolonial frame because we can see like some of the words that the headlines used actually suggested decolonizing this idea of glamour. So so that way, like you can kind of identify the frames. You can name the frames yourself as to like what these frames are as well. And you can look for like, see what kind of language, like phrases your interview subject actually uses to relate to these different frames, and what are the ways that you can relate to as well. And then you can write up like few sections analyzing the interviewee's transcript along different frames. So 3 is not a magic number. Again, I've just like put 3 because sometimes it's kind of easier to look at like about 3 themes in a data set as well. But yeah, so you can maybe that's like more than 3 that you can look at in your report as well, but that comes much later when you're doing your final assignment. But I guess like these are like some of the tips you might want to kind of consider when you actually come to that stage of doing the analysis. So I have here another article that you can kind of download. So it's from one of our colleagues here at the Media and Comms program, Dr. Wilfred Wang. So he did actually some analysis around in Weibo, like how social media users shared sort of things about a specific news report around an accident that happened in China. So I'm not going to go into details about this. Like you can have a bit of a download and have a read through, especially the section how he has organized the writing part, the analysis part of the framing. So he has identified like 3 frames, and he's kind of named these frames and supporting that logic with some of the quotations that he has found from the social media posts. But I think it's really helpful to think about how some of this would apply in the context of our interview transcripts as well. And it's a helpful example. Like if you want to look at how you can actually write a framing analysis, you can kind of do that a little bit on your own time as well. All right, so I guess what we covered in the lecture is like we try to define what is framing, and we looked at the origins of a framing analysis, and then we looked at the types of framing, but also thought about adapting framing analysis for interviews in a social media kind of a context. So in the seminars, I guess we can practice framing analysis a bit using some further examples as well. And next week, we will talk about actor network theory. Thank you so much for listening to the recording.